So, good evening, everybody. In this series of webinars from NES India, today we are going to have a very enigmatic topic, and the speaker is exactly opposite, quite a simple person, Dr. Amit Keshri from SGPGI, my alma mater. And the best part is that this Meniere's disease, angiofibroma, and cochlear implants, as we know, Amit Keshri, this all has been injected by our teacher, Dr. Isha Tyagi. So he is going to demystify some of the myths and some of the confusions about this Meniere's disease. And in the panel, we have Dr. Naren Suratwala from Surat. He is President NES currently. Dr. Sanjeev Mohanty from Chennai, a surgeon par excellence and an academician. Dr. Srinivas Dorasala, an innovator. And we all have witnessed his passion about this vertigo, and he talks, we have already listened to him quite a lot. So I'll ask Dr. Amit Keshri to start the presentation, and then in the end we will be ready to take your questions. So over to Amit Keshri.
Right. So thanks a lot, Pawan sir. At the outset, I think it was a very good idea at the NES to do this webinars, and I have included all the point which was discussed regarding the Meniere's disease in previous all webinars, and we'll try to cover. So what I have done in this webinar is that I have taken the evidence from all the literature which has published in last 10 years on Meniere's disease, including the 2020 American Academy Clinical Practice Guidelines. So I think I would start. So what is the goal of presentation? So goal of this presentation is to understand the pathophysiology. What is the patient characteristics, the diagnosis, investigation, and the management. So we will go one by one in the same. So we all know that the Meniere's disease was described way back by 1861 by Prosper Meniere's. So it is a classic triad of spontaneous attacks of vertigo, which is every word of it is very important. Should be the spontaneous attacks of vertigo, fluctuating sensorineural hearing loss, and tinnitus. So if all 3 points are there with oral fullness, we call it the classical Meniere's. There may be some other terms. The one is cochlear hydrops, where there is no vestibular symptoms. The patient has fluctuating hearing loss. The pathology is somewhat similar. And then there is a vestibular hydrops, which is also known as Tumarkin pathologic crisis. So here the patient falls spontaneously but does not lose consciousness. And it is not there initially in the patients. Later on, when the disease progress, the Tumarkin pathologic crisis happens. So we all know that in the pathophysiology, what is known to us is that there is a pressure of the endolymph, and there is a resultant problem of resonance membrane, and there is a potassium-rich fluid which come out. So one popular theory is it is due to the abnormal amount of fluids in the inner ear. What are the causes? Nobody knows the exact causes, but there are various factors like autoimmune disorders, genetic, sometimes it is vascular, dietary, allergy, autonomic, or endocrine. So these are the possible factors. And these are very, very important. These factors are important because the work has been done for the treatment on these factors. So pathophysiology affects segments are cochlea and the saccule, but also to some extent utricule and semicircular canal, especially the ampulla. So type 2 hair cells is what we discussed already, that it is the type 2 hair cell which is the most affected, and there is a loss of efferent nerve endings. Overstimulation of the vestibular branch of the cranial nerve 8 impairs the postural reflex and stimulate vomiting. And the recent studies suggest that the rupture do not occur, but there is a redistribution of the fluid occur in the endolymph, which is a potassium rich. So there is a redistribution of fluid. Coming to what we get from the literature in the pathophysiology. So what they have done, they have injected gadolinium inside the middle ear cavity through the tympanic membrane, and they have studied. So in this paper, they have studies almost 178 patients. So what they have, progression of endolymphatic hydrops appear to be directional, initiated in the cochlea. So since it is initiated in the cochlea, and the order of endolymphatic hydrotic severity gradually decrease from cochlear apical turn to the cochlear basal turn and then to the vestibule. So the cochlea is involved, and cochlea is involved in such a manner that the severity decrease from the cochlear apical turn to the basal turn. And endolymphatic hydrops, when come into the vestibule, then only the symptoms of Meniere's disease happen. So there is some already when the disease starts in the cochlea, and then slowly it involves the vestibule. So we have always some hearing loss, although sometimes the hearing may not have involved before the disease progress. It is not very symptomatic. And we all know there is a low frequency hearing loss. So what coming to that, we don't know what exactly is the Meniere disease. What is the cause of it? So there are various factors which leads to it, and where comorbidity is a co-compounding factor, you can say. So the one is stress. Stress can itself aggravate the disease, and it is one of the important factors because the disease itself causes some stress. And then when there is a lot of fatigue at the end of the day, sometimes the Meniere's can become. The other is that there's a trilogy of migrainous vertigo on one side, there is Meniere's disease, and then there is an intermingling of the two diseases. I mean, the patient has symptoms of Meniere's disease, but has also migraine. So there is this subset of patient that Gawani et al. In Annals in 2018, they have described that the patient who does not respond to diuretics in Meniere's, they respond to the prophylaxis of migraine therapy. So sometimes the headache may not be that severe to pinpoint that it is a migrainous vertigo, but you can have the symptoms of Meniere's disease, and if the patient is not responding to diuretics, then you might think of adding the prophylaxis of migraine. Hypertension is also an independent risk factor, and diabetes. So diabetes, it has been already published that in ECTA in 2018, that diabetes is an independent risk factor. So the patient who have diabetes in the subset of Meniere disease are more prone than the normal population. Then middle ear infection, premenstrual edema, they are very less in the literature. History of allergies. So now there is a recommendation by American Academy that for allergy is one of the causes of Meniere's disease. So we can think about doing allergy testing, because the benefit of and the side effect of doing an allergy testing is very less as compared to if you find any association between the Meniere's disease. Although some further work needs to be done. Then coming to the recent viral infection, smoking. Smoking is an independent factor. Alcohol use, those who use alcohol, we already know that what is the effect on vestibule. So it has vestibule due to the inherent properties of the alcohol to get absorbed into the vestibular system due to the increased blood supply. Then there is high salt intake, which is also very important. We will come to it, and the chronic exposure to the loud sound. Coming to the genetics. So they have found out that the unilateral Meniere disease, which eventually have bilateral disease in 20-25 of the patient, especially after a decade or so. So there may be either a sporadic disease, but if concurrent migraine, autoimmune or familial is Meniere's disease observed, patients are out of this group. So there may be a subset of patients with the sporadic Meniere disease. There may be concurrent migraine. There may be autoimmune disease, and there may be familial. So the delayed is hearing loss precedes the vertigo, and familial is obviously familial, and sporadic Meniere's disease with migraine. So my emphasis is here that when we treat patient of Meniere's disease, symptoms with Meniere's disease, and we are following American Academy guidelines, they're not responding, we have to use the migraine treatment. Then there is autoimmune phenomena. So autoimmune usually involve both the ear together, and there is a lot of hearing loss. And there may be other symptoms of the autoimmune diseases, either in the skin or the systemic involvement. In bilateral, the unilateral hearing loss become bilateral. It may be sporadic, and then again the same. So sporadic and delayed Meniere's is there, and there is a familial, and there is with the migraine, and there is with the autoimmune. So coming to the genotype, this genotype they have find out that is 494, 7296 is, if it is there, it is autoimmune, and in familial categories is the candidate for gene therapy. So there is a genetic factors involved. Coming to how we diagnose the Meniere's disease, history is very important. We have from the second lecture of the webinar, we can understand that history is it is, first we have to ask, is it a true vertigo? What is the duration of symptoms? Because we know that it is minutes to hours, the duration of symptom, along with any aura. Most of the patients tell that they have some, before the attacks of vertigo, they have some oral fullness, they have some mild nausea before the real start. So they can preempt their attacks. What is the relieving factors when the patient get relief at the rest or taking any drugs or vestibular sedatives? What are the GI symptoms? As we know that there is some autonomic system involvement, which is due to the hyperstimulation of the vestibular component, and that stimulate the autonomic system, which lead to nausea, vomiting, sometime to diarrhea also. So what is the relation with posture? I have seen few patients of Meniere's disease who are on treatment and they respond very well to the medical therapy initially. After 1 month, they come back, or 2 months come back that I am having the vertigo. This vertigo may not be the same as the Meniere's, and this may be only BPVP. So you have to find out that what was the duration of attacks, what are the, it has any relation to the posture. So it does not truly suggest that your therapy has failed. The another disease which was there maybe or may not be there has developed later on the due course, or the patient is there for 6 months, he has been absolutely fine after the medical therapy and dietary management. You come back again and you see that the patient is not responding. It may be Meniere's disease, which will be cured by the Dix-Hallpike and Epplis maneuver. So then coming to the comorbidities, we have already talked about it: diabetes, hypertension, smoking, and other comorbidities, especially old age. These all add up to the Meniere's symptoms. So coming to a typical patient, complains of recurrent attack of severe vertigo lasting for a few minutes to hours, mostly few hours, 2 hours to 4 hours, but up to 12, and some textbook also describe up to 24 hours. So you have to find out. And also it is important that the first attack of Meniere's disease sometime may look like the vestibular neuritis. The only difference would be the video head impulse test or the head impulse test will try to differentiate between the two. It is usually associated with tinnitus, oral fullness, and hearing loss. We all know GI symptoms I have already talked about. Here the interesting study is by this Ear, Nose and Throat Journal. There is increased salivary amylase in Meniere's disease and not in BPVP. So what they have done that in emergency, they have tried to do the salivary amylase of all the patients, and they have found out that when they present in emergency, there is a very significant increase in salivary amylase level in Meniere's disease patient, which is not there in other patients. Then psychological stress affecting well-being and quality of life. Even the American guidelines say that the quality of life is hampered. And once the quality of life hampered, the stress get attenuated. So it's a vicious cycle. The stress give rise to more attacks of Meniere's disease, and the more attack give rise to the bad quality of life. SF36 is the good, but we can develop typical Meniere's type. So what are the typical cases? We have read in the textbook that it is usually the low frequency hearing loss. But by the time patient reach to us, it is already some time has elapsed. If it is a first episode or maybe first few episodes, you will have low frequency. But initially then it involved all the frequency. Here in the test, we have covered all the tests. The short increment sensitivity index, which in our clinical practice, we do most of the time in most of the time, I find that the short increment sensitivity index is very, very important to diagnose it if the symptoms are suggestive. So in most of the cases of menias, we typically find that the SISI index is approx 100%. So SISI index, according to me, is quite effective if we have a unilateral disease to start with. So if SISI is 100% positive, then it's also kind of suggestive that retrocochlear hearing loss may not be there. So this test we usually do in our clinical practice. So you will see that this is another case, which is a far advanced disease. And here you can see on the left side, the SISI test is almost 100%. And compare the right side. The patient has some age-related SNHL also, but it is 0 and 5%. Here it is 100%. So it is, if it is closer to 100%, 90 to 100, you can have some idea about it. Coming to the investigation, we all know that mainly it is a historical diagnosis, and you have to do a audiological test where PTA is very, very important, pure 10 threshold. And we know that we have to have 20 decibel or more hearing loss. And it has to be documented during the attacks if it is possible. We will come about it. SISI is old test but useful. ABR can be done to rule out the retrocochlear hearing loss or the acoustic schwannoma sometimes. ECOG, we had a talk about it. I will talk about it. So in short, transtympanic ECOG results show an increased ratio of somatic potential to extend which is usually greater than 35%. Then nystagmus may be there, which I will talk about. Dix-Hallpike I usually do for my patient. Unterberger test and otoscopy. This is what I do usually in my clinical practice. Other tests, we have WEM caloric test, and we have already discussed about it. And I will discuss in the radiological MRI, gadolinium enhanced MRI can be done. But many a time it shows some endolymphatic hydrops features, or it's ruled out, mainly to rule out that it is a acoustic, if it is not dealing with any acoustic neuroma. And HRCT may be done if there is something in the otoscopy or something. So coming to the nystagmus, classically there may be 3 phases. The irritative phase. In irritative phase, the horizontal nystagmus beating towards the affected ear lasts for less than an hour. In paralytic phase, beats away from the affected ear, and this lasts for a few days, hours to few days. So initially this nystagmus towards the beating affected ear is there, and after that it goes to the other ear. And in the recovery phase again, which lasts for the same duration, it can be seen in the affected side only. Coming to the ECOG, the transtympanic ECOG is more sensitive. But what is the clinical utility of ECOG? Even the American Academy Guidelines, which is published in 2020, do not recommend doing ECOG because ECOG is not 100% sensitive and a specific test. It is a specificity of around 80% and sensitivity of around 70 to 80%. And the patient may have symptom of Meniere's, classical Meniere's, but may have a normal ECOG. So a negative ECOG does not say. So you can see that there was a survey in the American Neurological Otology and Neurology that ECOG is used by less than 10 to 15% of the patient, by the surgeons in the clinical practice. So it is important. Excuse me. So, sorry for the interruption. So it is important that the ECOG is not relied completely for the diagnosis. It is a good tool to have. And coming to the ECOG, what are the things which come close to ECOG and can be done in usual practice? So in our institute, the glycerol dehydration test and the sensitivity of dehydration test is approximately 66%, which is similar to ECOG. ECOG is 55%. And it is very important to find if there is an improvement after giving the glycerol. So a gain of 10 decibel or more above in the pure 10 threshold, or increase of 10% above the schizophrenia cone is positive test. And it is performed after giving glycerol. And we can discuss it later that how it is done. how people do it. But the important is that in the validity and reliability of diagnostic tests, the glycerol deacetation test is as good as ECOG. Coming to the diagnosis, we all know that the angiogenesis criteria. The definite medius is 2 and more attacks of spontaneous vertigo, which last 20 minutes, usually lasts for hours, with documented hearing loss by P-Orton audiometry, tinnitus and oral failness, and other causes are excluded, which is important that I said earlier that the other causes like like vestibular neuritis, like I do in my clinical practice, the Unterberger test and a Dix-Alpike test. If there is some vague complaints or if there is no audiometric loss or if there is no hearing loss, we must do it. And probable is same thing without a documented hearing loss, because the patient may come in the interval period and there may be the first and second episode and there is no hearing loss at all. So the possible is vertigo, but there is no oral symptoms. Coming to the natural history, we have to know about what is the natural history of the Meniere's disease. In early cases, there is only vertigo and there is no documented hearing loss. In later, low frequency hearing loss develop, seen in few number of patients. Progressed disease has both significant hearing loss and vestibular loss, leading to kind of a flat audiogram, which I have seen, I have already shown in 1 or 2 cases. Last is lead to the complete hearing loss with or without vertigo, which is called die-down Meniere's disease. Sadly, in approx 40 to 50% of the cases, eventually it involves the other ear. So you have to counsel the patient that you might have symptoms in the other ear. Coming to the differential diagnosis, trauma can be also by history. Inner ear and middle ear diseases, especially the autoimmune diseases, is very, very important, which is coming up as important factors in a differential diagnosis. And I've already talked about the acute attack of vestibular neuritis. The first attack of Meniere's and can look like, but you have to find out. And vestibular migraine and migrainous vertigo or migrainous vertigo can have interposition or can have symptoms similar to Meniere's disease. What is the management? So actually there is no definite management because we don't know what is the etiology, the definite. But the treatment does not stop the natural progression of disease. All treatment is there to elevate the vertigo and the associated strokes. So how can we help our patient? So we can help our patient by patient education, dietary management, medical management, and intratympanic therapy, and surgical management. So we will now come to the management. We have covered the in history part, investigations. So we'll come to what is there in the management. So the patient education is very, very important because many of the patients when comes, they are so debilitated by their vertigo episode and you have to elevate their anxiety, explain what is the prognosis, which you know by the natural history. And you have to explain about the safety if they are driving or then how they should be and how do they cope off. How you have to tell the patient that, okay, I will elevate your vertigo. So as soon as I tell my patient that I will elevate your vertigo, they get better. I mean, they have to have some belief in the treating physician. And when they are relieved of the vertigo, the next point they ask is that, doctor, I am still having the tinnitus and some hearing loss, which we can not do much about at this point of time, except the tinnitus retraining therapy and other. So the communication is important. And then there is an interpersonal relationship. So what works? So the most important thing is low sodium diet. So the target is less than 3 grams. And Miyashita et al. In 2017 in NL have that there is an increased aldosterone. So in the Meniere's disease, so if you give decreased sodium less than 3 ng, less than 3 grams, which we do for the cardiac patients, if you remember, then it is very important. The other important point is that what is the feedback? Sometimes the patients say that I am taking less sodium, but the urinary spot sodium, which is a very simple test, which is done, and we do it. I will show you that how we do it. If it is less than 50 millimole, then it is important that the patient, if it is lesser, then there is no attacks of vertigo. So whenever there is a patient has management medical therapy now present with attacks of vertigo, when you do a spot sodium, urinary sodium, you find out that there is low caffeine diet. So whenever I tell my patient, my first thing I tell them, okay, I will tell Vertigo, first thing I tell them that you have to decrease your caffeine intake, and you have to tell that tea, coffee, chocolate, cold drink, energy drinks all have caffeine. Salt, pickle in India, then there is papad, and there are other snacks which are very high in salt. And the patient unknowingly in chips and other processed foods, there is a lot of salt. Avoid monosodium glutamate, which is already now not being used. Then water intake. So it has essentiated effect. Low sodium and increased water intake has good effects on the sodium overall and the Meniere's disease. Then anti-secretory factor, alcohol and tobacco are the important factors which we should teach if the patient is smoking or on tobacco or in alcohol. The intake should be decreased. This is the erroneous spot sodium. So you can see that here it is 65 for a patient. And this patient has acute attack. So when I tell him the dietary restriction, I call him after 1 month, I get the test done again. And if it is below 50, it is kind of like managing your sugars, that how it should be, HbA1c or 3 months. So if you can do it every 2 to 3 months, you know that where it is. And many a time I'm able to manage my patient with only diet, no drugs. So coming to the medical management, we already talked about that we are treating vertigo here. So the vestibular sedatives has a role. The other drugs which has a role is diuretics, which works very well in our hand. But there is two groups of people. The one is use diuretics. The other say that the diuretics has effect on the hearing loss. Especially the thiazide diuretics have some on the hearing loss and the sodium balance. So there is another school of thought we don't use, but we regularly use diuretics in a little intermediate term, not very long term, and it works. Then coming to the beta-azotine, the doses are important. We usually prescribe 24 mg BD initially for 4 to 6 weeks, and then we kind of taper off, or you just stop it. Sinarigine also works fine. I will come about which drugs. Then there are questionable amount of drugs, but yes, they work sometime, especially if the patient has some tinnitus, disabling, like paracetamol, ginkgo biloba, methylcobalamin, vitamin D. These are not very proven therapy. The proven therapy is the diuretics and beta-azotine. So coming to the drug beta-azotine. So we will see that what is important here is that they have done a study where they have given no medication or beta-azotine or sinarigine or clonazepam or ginkgo biloba. So they have given multiple drugs, and they have seen that the patient who does not receive beta-azotine has more symptoms than the patient who received the beta-azotine. And it is effective when it is given for 2 to 3 months. There is no study more than 120 days to give beta-azotine. The other important point is that few of the, especially Michael Stirrup has suggested that we should use very high quantity of beta-azotine because there may be some more metabolizer. And then he started the MAO inhibitor, which is salicyline, if they have come up with the paper in 2018. But you have to take it with a pinch of salt. Because the beta-azotine, I think, works very well. If it is not working, then giving very high dose with such a side effect, we have other drugs. So we have talked about the vestibular sedatives. Now there is a combination, which is the combination is of, like Dr. Srinivas told, that we have to be very open to the newer drugs which are coming. And it's not like that if the literature say that this one drug has some side effect, it should not be used. If you use any drug judiciously, you can do the same thing. So the fixed dose combination of sinarigine and diamidate versus beta-azotine. So there is a study to compare group. And in this study, surprisingly, they have no statistical significance. Here we can say that there is no statistical significance with that statistically significant improvement. So important point here is that in 12 weeks period, if they did a comparison, then there is no statistically significant difference between the two treatment game could be established. There was a marginally better in beta-azotine group, which the data is there below. But the important point here is that you can use a fixed rate combination of sinarigine and diamidate. But the important is that it has some vestibular sedative, which more vestibular sedation than betahistine. So then you have to tailor-made drug according to your. So if my advice is that, which I do sometime, is that if the betahistine is not giving me the desired result in initial few days, I add either sinaragine or the combination. So coming to the diuretics. So what are the diuretics we use? So diuretics, exactly what they do is that they decrease the sodium from the body, and we have already talked about the role of the sodium in the management of Meniere's disease. So thiazide dioxide is used for long-term management to prevent attacks of vertigo. A combination of thiazide and thiazide because of the potassium loss. If you add with the spironolactone, which is the potassium sparing diuretics. So in India, we have a brand name called Lacilactone. I should not take the brand name, but it's a Lacilactone, which is a combination of thiazide and diuretics. And I use in half a strength, which is 50 mg. And I use it in half a strength. And I mean, I use 25 mg of, which is a combination of thiazide and spironolactone. And it gives us the other drug, which is second favored drug after the thiazide, is acetazolamide. So the acetazolamide is very, very useful, but it is a very number of side effects because of the acidosis. And the other side effect is the loss of potassium. So many a time patient complain of some weakness or fatigability, easy fatigability. So if you give acetazolamide, you have to use some fruit juices or some other thing to, but at the same time, it does not give side effect in all the patients of Meniere disease. So it is important that the acetazolamide, when it is used, then we should be aware about its side effect, and we should also tell the patient, because sometimes we give acetazolamide in other cases like in CSF rhinorrhea or after the surgery or just before as a conservative management to decrease the CSF. So we see that there is a side effect, and many neurologists use acetazolamide as the first management, but sometimes I prefer the combination of thiazide and spironolactone. Coming to the Meniere device. So Meniere device is a device which is by Medtronic, and it is works on the pressure therapy. So if you apply the pressure. So this is a very controversial thing, because they did a study, did a study in where they have used three things. The first is placebo, no treatment. There is a grommet, and there is a Meniere device. They say the results in Meniere device and simple grommet insertion is similar. There is no significant difference between the two. But if you see the trial by the Meniere, there is a lot of promising therapy this is. So whenever we see any study, we have to see that who is the funding agency to that, or if this is a company driven or whatever. So I think if Meniere device is working as good as grommet, so we can use a grommet. If there is, but we don't use this more frequently. Sometime there was a local vendor in India who produced kind of Meniere's device. We used that, but it was not as effective as by published literature. So coming to if the patient is responding to the medical therapy, this is good, fine enough. What I do is I tell them first there's a diet, then diuretics and betahistine. Then after I try to withdraw the betahistine, which I call them after 6 weeks, if there is no episode of vertigo, which usually is, and then I stop, and then I give diuretics, only drug for a little longer time, for maybe 4 to 6 months. And once it is there, I taper it by alternate day, and then we stop the diuretics. And the patient is on dietary management till he have the acute attack. And for acute attack, we have a lot of drug like dihemidinate. And so for the acute attacks of the Meniere's disease, there are 3 drugs, which is there. There are dihemidinate, and the other is meclizine and a diazepam. According to the American Academy guidelines, all 3 drugs are equally effective and anyone can be given. You have to know the side profile of each drug and which your patient can tolerate, and if the patient is having any side effect. So for the acute attack of the Meniere's disease, you have to instruct the patient that he can take a vestibular sedative for 2 to 3 days. when there is a attacks are there. And all these patients have some pre-pneumonias, and there's a typical menias that, okay, now the heaviness is increasing and I will have symptoms. So they can start taking the DAT drug for 1 to 2 days, depending upon how much attacks they are getting, 50 hours to. So, and coming to the intratympanic therapy is very promising. And there are two kinds of intratympanic therapy. The one is intratympanic steroid, either it is dexamethasone and methylprednisolone. So it is used when medical therapy is not effective and the vertigo is not controlled, but the hearing loss is serviceable. So the serviceable hearing loss definition is more than less than 50% of the speech discrimination and 50 decibel of the hearing loss. If both is there, then it is non-serviceable. There is some changes there, here and there, but this is what we usually follow. So how do we give intratympanic therapy? Intratympanic therapy, the anesthesia can be done with 10% phenol. So you take a small swab stick, 10% phenol dip, you put it there, it changes the color of the tympanic membrane, it take away the surface, kind of also does the surface anesthesia. Then either in microscope or endoscopy, in our usual practice, I will talk about, we use endoscope. So we can do. The other thing is that we also use the lignocaine, which is 10% lignocaine. It works. People say that it should not work because there is no mucous membrane or there is no intact. But in our clinical practice, when you use it 4 to 5 minutes before the injection, it works. So we use 0.5 to 0.7 ml of dexamethasone, transtympanic under endoscope and maximum dependent position of the round window, which is important that you have to keep the patient for 10 to 20 minutes on a dependent position. So coming to the low dose gentamicin. So if the patient is not having relief, and the advantage of using steroid is that it also has very good effect on the hearing sometimes. So here improve sometimes, especially in the earlier cases, but the gentamicin can cause hearing loss. But in clinical practice, when you use very low dose gentamicin, so if it is a buffer gentamicin, it is very good. So in India, we got 80 mg per 2 ml injection. So if you use 0.5 ml of that injection into the middle ear, you get this very good. And we use single dose, and which is, if it is repeated, if the patient do not have symptom for 3 to 4 weeks, if there are symptoms is there, I do not give the weekly injection or titrate the doses. Sometimes they give twice weekly injection. There is a lot of difference in the practice clinician across the thing. Then the concept of a titration dose is no more recommended, as vertigo is similar with repeated single dose. If we repeat the dose, there is a high chances of the loss of hearing. Head impulse test is a positive predictor and more in horizontal and anterior canal. So it is one of the predictor where you say whether gentamicin is working or not working. So coming to, we did a small study. I will just take 2 minutes to our experience. It was a prospective study, and we did in our SGPGI long back. And this is a gentamicin, which is 2 ml, and we use a spinal needle, narrow caliber spinal needle. We keep this position to the patient, and then we inject. And while we inject in this area, and before that you can use the phenol to make it, and then you can inject. And you see the rise. If you use an endoscope or microscope, you see the rise. So the fluid level will start rising, and it will then the fluid will egress from the station tube to instruct patient not to swallow. So the important point is that you can penetrate here, and this is the long needle, or you can also use 26 gauge 1.5 inch needle, which many otologists use to inject in the canal for the anesthesia while doing surgery. So, but we are very comfortable with this syringe, and you can put inside, and you can just see it has to rise. So you take around 0.6 ml, 0.7 ml of solution, but you inject actually around 0.3 to 0.5 ml of solution, depending upon that when you see it has risen up. So what was the result of this test? So in 60%, there was a complete cure after single dose of And then there was in 28% of the substantial and no improvement in 12% of the patients. Coming to the hearing loss was not much for initially 2 months, but it had some patient with hearing loss in later ages, which I do not know that it is due to the disease itself, which we have done nothing about it, or it is the effect of long-term effect of gentamicin, which I think otherwise is due to the disease itself. So it is very important that if you give one single dose, it is very effective in almost 80 to 90% of the patient, and you might repeat a job 3 to 4 weeks later, depending upon the response. Otherwise, you can give 3 doses. We do 3 doses. Otherwise, we go to the other treatment options. So coming to there is the comparison. So intratympanic therapy in Meniere's disease, they say that the subject receiving intratympanic gentamicin required fewer injection and had a significantly lower time to failure than intratympanic dexamethasone. So when they compare that in the similar group of patients, they did in the 2 arms, and the gentamicin arm was the most important point here is that they have used the low dose intratympanic, and audiometric outcomes were similar. So it does not matter that if you use a low dose and single injection, the audiometry does not change. Okay, so the use of intratympanic just initial therapy of early and long-term control Meniere disease is safe and effective. And there is a chances of hearing loss, yes, okay, but it is very less, maybe in 5% of the cases. And we always tell patients, and we what we do that if the patient has less than 30 decibel of hearing loss, we avoid giving gentamicin because of the litigations and other issues. Otherwise, if the patient is ready and if it is very disabling, we will use gentamicin, and we definitely use it as a first line therapy when it is more than 50 decibel of hearing loss, or the speech discrimination is worse than 50%. So coming to the surgical management, if the patient does not respond to the medical management, then we come to the surgery. So the surgery is 2 kinds. The one is non-destructive surgery, and the other is destructive surgery. We will talk about the destructive. So endolymphatic sac decompression. So endolymphatic sac is a branded SAM surgery by the 2018 trial, which was done. What they did, that they did a mastoidectomy on one side, and they did a endolymphatic sac decompression. And they said that there is not significant improvement between the 2 patients. But surprisingly, when there was no treatment and mastoidectomy and the endolymphatic sac decompression, the no treatment patients were worse, but the mastoidectomy and the endolymphatic sac decompression patient were doing better. So actually, in some centers, like our center in SGPGI, our previous professor and head, Professor Issa Tyagi, used to do endolymphatic sac surgery. And I have patients who are coming after 20 years, 18 years, 15 years after the surgery without symptom and presenting again with the same symptoms. So we have a discharge summary and we have a data to verify that was done. And in few of the cases, I have seen that they are not able to identify the sac, but they have decompressed the posterior facet and the results were very, very good. So I do it maybe once a year. Recently, we will be talking about this surgery in the last of the webinar. But the endolymphatic sac decompression was done around 9 months back in my institute by Dr. Sampath. We will talk about the surgery, and the patient is very symptom free. Coming to this, you put shunt or do not put shunt, it does not matter. You have to just decompress the endolymphatic sac, which is important. And in selected cases, it works, especially in my hand in my center. So coming to the endolymphatic sac surgery, a systematic review and meta-analysis. I will just read the conclusion. Endolymphatic sac surgery is effective at controlling vertigo in short term and long term. So even 1 year and 2 year follow-up, at least 75% of the patients with Meniere disease who have failed medical therapy. So the important point is that if you have 100 patients, 80 will be managed by the dietary and the medical management. So rest 20% is, or maybe 15%, 10-15% are there, will not respond to the medical therapy. And out of that 20%, if you do an endolymphatic sac decompression surgery, where the Any complications is very, very less than 1%, less than 1%, 0.2, 0.3%, according to the literature. If you decompress the endolymphatic sac and you have 2 to 4 years of drug-free period and maybe more. So in our case, I will say the data we have done in around 5 patients and all are doing well. They further added the sac decompression and mastoid shunting technique provides similar vertigo control. So either do a sock surgery or you put a shunt opening it is same. Mastoid shunting with or without C elastic also provides similar vertigo. So there is no difference. So this is a meta and systemic review and meta-analysis, which is highest evidence. Coming to the, again, current opinion and literature review, the endolymphatic sac surgery. The endolymphatic sac surgery with all variant is a good option for patient with incapacitating endolymphatic hydros, providing a high percentage of vertigo control and hearing preservation. So if my patient has a good hearing within 20 to 30 decibel, he is rehabilitated vertigo, I do intratympanic dexamethasone or methylprednisolone, some use methylprednisolone, diagnosis with that drug. And the important point is, if they are not responding, I go to the endolymphatic sac surgery. So we have done around 5 cases in last 2 years, and four has pneumatized mastoid. We could identify the sac. When one have severe sclerosis, but this patient also has responded well. So there is a literature which says that we have to find out, the American Academy Research Guidelines says that we have to find out if even the general anesthesia may have some effect on this as good as the mastoidectomy and decompression surgery. So none of the patient has any drop in the hearing loss. All of them are drug free at present. And I think we started doing it after, I think I started doing around 2016. Before that, I did not believe in, because I saw a lot of patients coming back from my institute, and then I visited the Hauser Institute. They did surgeries, and I have seen long-term follow-up the patient coming years after the surgery with the good effect. So if it is done in some center, and if the patient come back after the years of the diagnosis, it says that it is a good promising. Coming to the destructive surgery, labyrinthectomy is the one surgery which I will cover first, because in the labyrinthectomy, you can do transmastoid surgery. And if you take proper precautions of not injuring the ampullary and another thing, non-ampullary end, you prevent the facial nerve injury. The success rate is very good, nearly 100%, not in long term. But after the introduction of gentamicin, this has gone down. But even then, you can give it a trial. Coming to the vestibular neurectomy, it is done in my institute in conjunction with a neurosurgeon, and my previous Professor Tagi did a lot. It is almost 100%. But now the papers, long-term papers has come up. There is some cross connection with cochlear nerve. And in 2018 paper, and there is another paper which has come in 2020 itself, that we say that due to the inferior vestibular nerve and the cochlear nerve communication, this is not 100% effective. So, but it is very effective, but you have to also say it is an intradural procedure. You have to do a small craniotomy to find out that what it is. So it is important. So coming to the labyrinthectomy and vestibular neurectomy. So they compared for intractable vertigo symptoms, both the things, and the conclusion I will just read that vestibular nerve section and labyrinthectomy achieve high comparable rates of vertigo control. So they are almost similar. The labyrinthectomy can be done transmastoid. There are lesser side effect, and vestibular nerve suction is the last resort in the surgery, but it is very, very effective at the same time. So coming to that, what is the management? So there is an individualized management of medical therapy and other surgeries. So the non-surgical management, which is dietary and medical management, and endolymphatic sac decompression or any variant, have very good effect, and they have also very good effect on the quality of life, and they're very, very effective. If they are not working, you can either do vestibular neurectomy and labyrinthectomy, taking the patient in the decision making, and your surgical team and your surgical experience team. So the management of the depend upon what is the stage of vertigo, how is the quality of life involved, is there any surgical contraindication, is there subjective desire to patient to go any surgery, or he is not want any surgery. So coming to this, is there a treatment consensus? So the European, and I will also cover the American guidelines. So we have talked about the dietary, medical, and intertympanic therapy, and then non-destructive and destructive surgery. These are the 5 options. But important is also the patient counseling. So in the they have international consensus, and this was a big group from the Europe. So they'll say that the change in lifestyle, this is very, very important, like stress, alcohol, another thing, caffeine, another thing, and use of vestibular rehabilitation in interictic period, and psychotherapy. Conservative medical treatment is first line. The author recommend use of diuretics and beta-estine, or local pressure therapy, which is, my sense, if you just put a grommet, if you want to try, it is as effective as Minier device, which is costly device. When medical treatment find a recommendation used to second line treatment, which consists of intertympanic injection of steroid. So they have put a second line as intertympanic steroid, and then the third line as the intertympanic gentamicin and endolymphatics sac surgery, depending upon what is the hearing status of the patient. So the very option is destructive surgical treatment. It is labyrinthectomy. And with the labyrinthectomy, the advantage is that you can do a cochlear implant. So I have done cochlear implant for bilateral Meniere's leading to profound hearing loss. Patient received multiple episodes of Meniere's disease. It was already severe hearing loss, bilateral. And after that, gentamicin decreased the vertigo, but it is not completely cured. And I have to do a cochlear implant. So I did a labyrinthectomy and the cochlear implant. So I have around 4 to 5 patients that they do very well. The only problem is that a tinnitus in non-implanted ear, obviously we are not doing bilateral implant for bilateral Meniere disease with bilateral profound hearing loss. So in the non-implant ear is a problem. And they have some problem with, they're not as good as the non-Meniere's patient if you compare with the same criteria of hearing loss since last five years. But they are very, very happy, and translab, labyrinthectomy and cochlear implant is a very good option these days. So coming to what really works, this is again a meta-analysis, and it goes with the international consensus, and this is what we follow. We categorize efficacy. So the efficacy and safety of beta-estine plus thiazide diuretics, caffeine restrictions, intertympanic corticosteroid, intertympanic psychological support, salt restriction, and vestibular rehabilitation. Vestibular rehabilitation has a role in interictal period, not in the acute attacks of the Meniere's disease, where you have to give the vestibular sedatives and there is no role of any. But in the interictal period, it works. And I think Dr. Srinivas we can discuss about that, how it is working in Meniere's disease, how much role it has. Then coming to the protocol, so the importance is low salt diet. I will just, this is one of the final 3-4 slides, which we'll go through. Alcohol, we are talking about, tobacco is lifestyle modifications. And in diuretics, oral or intramuscular intertympanic steroids, if it has acute attacks. In acute attacks, they recommend that diuretics, intramuscular therapy can also, the steroid therapy can work to abort that acute attack because the inflammation is decreased. Treatment failure Meniere device, which I don't agree, sac surgery, gentamicin, vestibular ectomy, and labyrinthectomy. I will put this here. Then coming to the AHONS guidelines, this is a very comprehensive guideline, and we should, if we are treating Meniere's disease, this is a 48-page document they have come up with, and this is very, very important. And this sum up what we have already talked about. So I have kept it in the RAS. So the patient with knee episodic vertigo, history and examination, physical examination, 2 and more episode of vertigo with 20 minutes to 24 hours, no other cause. If migraine is present, then migraine only out of guidelines. So see, now they want to classify Meniere's disease as the patient has migraine or no migraine. So if there is a migraine, it goes out of the Meniere's disease criteria, and offer vestibular substance in acute attack of vertigo, and then obtain an audiogram. If there is a asymmetric hearing loss, asymmetric means the one side is more involved, then you may offer MRI, and to rule out diacoustic neuroma. But here, my important point is that SISI, you have to find out 600 patients and you scan patients of SISI positive, and you will find one patient of retrocochlear pathology or acoustic neuroma. But if you want to do it for the medical legal reasons, you can go ahead and may offer an MRI. That's purely a clinical and individual decision. You can talk patient, or you can tell that the MRI will rule out the pathology, and you can manage the lesions, because incidental vestibular neuroma can also be there. So do not order vestibular testing and ECOG. So in ECOG, it is important in ECOG that I missed one point. I will cover that. In ECOG, it is important that the transtympanic ECOG is done for more better sensitivity. And the other thing is that tone bursts are important than clicks. So tone burst and transtympanic has better results, but the American Academy guidelines and all over clinician opinion is that the vestibular test is very lesser load, and ECOG to diagnose, do not order vestibular test or ECOG to diagnose Meniere's disease. It's a clinical diagnosis, and clinical diagnosis is historical diagnosis and audiometric diagnosis. And should not offer positive pressure therapy, which is also my view. Educate patient about Meniere's disease, diet and lifestyle. We have already talked about caffeine and everything. Should not offer vestibular rehab for acute vertigo, but interictal period you can use. Coming to may offer diuretics and beta-estine. So this is very, very important that they have also talked about that in diuretics, the thiazide diuretics and works better. And in this group, the beta-estine is better than the other groups. But if the patient is not relevant, having side effect to beta-estine, if there is any other thing, contraindication, you can use the other drugs which are available in cinnarizine or the combination with the diamidine. So if symptom is controlled, you assess document outcomes. So the outcomes is very, very important. So I tell my patient to make a vertigo diary, and they come with that. So sometimes the patient will have aura, but no actual attack. So there may be some dizziness, some imbalance, but no vertigo episode. So you have to find out that what is working in one patient before you take to the next step. Then if it is the symptoms are not controlled, you go for intertympanic gentamicin. Symptoms control, which is usually the case, you again document. If there is a serviceable hearing, you give endolymphatic sac decompression, which they have said that there is no compelling evidence, but the meta-analysis and so otherwise, and you can offer either labyrinthectomy, and no recommendation regarding vestibular nerve sections. So they say that it is an intradural procedure, chances of facial nerve palsy, meningitis, and other symptoms. But to frankly tell you, if it is doing the minimal invasive retrosigmoid approach, there's not much risk. The team is experienced even, and vestibular rehabilitation should be given. So what is our protocol? So I see patient after the dietary modification, I give diuretics. Last two slide, I think I have just 2 minutes. So diuretics and beta-estine. If the treatment is not responding, I see how is the hearing. If it is hearing serviceable, I will either do dexamethasone. If not responding, I will come endolymphatic sac decompression. Hearing not serviceable, I do gentamicin or destructive surgery, which labyrinthectomy can be done. And if there is a response, then diuretics and beta-estine. So I first taper beta-estine, or I just stop it. The patient does not have any vertigo. And then diuretics, I like to taper and give around 4 to 6 months. And after 6 months, I just tell the patient to manage on the dietary modification. Patient, I would like to see every 8 weeks or so in my OPD to see if there is a sodium is getting controlled, just to give the feedback. They can also do the test at home. So this is a patient, I don't know the videos.
नमक से क्या दिक्कत होती है? नर्सों नमक जैसे खाते हैं तो कान में जो आवाज होती है ये तेज हो जाती है, थोड़ा सा नमक खा लेते हैं। जब तक दवा ले रहे थे तब तक क्या हो रहा था? दवा लेने पे डॉक्टर साहब सुस्त रहते थे, लेकिन उसके आराम मिला था मुझे का। चक्कर आता था कि नहीं आता? नहीं, चक्कर।
So the patient is saying that when he never takes salt, he have oral fullness, and when the salt intake is more, he has episode of vertigo. So this is the patient which presented to me in the second episode of Meniere's. He had low frequency hearing loss and a kind of a little flat audiogram. And this patient, I gave him diuretics and beta-estine. He took it for 6 weeks. I called him after 6 weeks. this patient I have seen in November, and he came to me in April next year after 6 or 7 months, and typically saying that it has a relation with sodium intake whenever he takes salts. And he thought that I asked him, why didn't you come? He said, I thought you have cured my disease. There was no vertigo. I have stopped the drugs, and I could not come due to some reasons. So this patient is very, very
दवा लेते वक्त करीब 10 दिन बाद चक्कर आया था उसके बाद
so the patient is saying that after 10 days he has, after taking the drugs, he has one episode, and after that there was no episode for the 6 to 8 weeks. So this was the patient which has who has this kind of hearing loss, and the hearing loss in between the interictal period, I mean the 8 months he does not have any vertigo, was same. There was no change at all. So with this, I would like to thank you for your kind intention, and Amit can this is further.
So Amit, it was fabulous as always from you. It was an excellent overview of the Meniere's disease, and you have almost touched upon all the topics and their recent advances. So I'll take the liberty to make a quick couple of comments, and then we will open the session to our moderators,
Yes.
to our panelists. So one thing, is, as you said, that it's basically the apical turn is more involved than basal, and ECOG is invasive investigation. So nowadays, based on this frequency specificity, the further more tests are coming up. One multi-frequency admittance test and this acoustic phase shift test. They maybe in a few years they might replace the ECOG. Secondly, this radiology is coming in a big way. For this MRI, but they are mostly just to add the things. I don't think that they will have a very great role clinically, but yes, to diagnose and to follow up patient, their MRI is being used. And
what happens in our clinical practice is that a patient goes to a neurologist most of the time and have an MRI. And I have noticed that in MRI, if you'll see, it may be observer bias. We need to do a kind of a test that on the side of more involvement, there is always in the hepatic sac is a little larger than the other side. But it is, I have not seen always. And we tried to do an intertympanic gadolinium.
Amit, just 1 minute. Can you stop your screen sharing so that people can see the video?
Stop sharing.
So, yeah. Amit, tell me one thing. This you told about vestibular aqueduct in MRI, right? So, but there is a recently one that thing came. If the CT scan they compared with the MRI, and on CT scan, if you don't find vestibular aqueduct, you have more predictive thing for MRI having endolymphatic hydrops in diagnosed cases. I'm talking about.
Right.
So that is one thing coming up, and just one question from my side. Then we'll take these other questions. Anesthesia, you said, do you really require local anesthesia? Because we use 26 gauge needle for intertympanic. So I was just for my.
Sir, I mean, I have seen that earlier we were not using. Then we tried using phenol. Phenol was good, but the ability was a problem. And it was just that I use in one of the patient 10% Xylocaine, and that patient does not move. Even we have seen few patients of around 9, 10, and 12 years, sir. I mean, the pediatric. And I mean, they also, I mean, if you do a counseling well, and if you tell them that this is it worked very well. So maybe that, I mean, anesthesia is not important, but I mean, the patient does complain of some pain. I mean, few of the patient, it's like
Fine.
a personal choice.
So, yeah, so I'll ask the panelists to chip in now, and I'll just read out the audience questions. So first question is, what's your take about the vestibular test battery in diagnosis? Maybe Dr. Srinivas can take this question. Vestibular test battery in diagnosis, especially VAMP and ECOG, as it may not be readily available. So how important they are in actually diagnosing? So
actually, when you look at the diagnostic criteria, it is basically dependent on the history. So those diagnostic criteria is basically most of it is dependent on the history itself. In addition to that, we should never forget the old audiological.
Srinivas, you're not audible. Can you come
Sir,
closer to? Yeah, okay.
sir, can you hear me now?
Yeah, little better. Still dull.
Okay, I don't
Okay.
know.
Go ahead. It's okay.
Okay, sir. So basically, the diagnosis of Meniere's disease has to be on the basis of history itself. And after that, when it comes to investigation, till now, pure tone audiometry, CC, they are much more reliable than anything else. But we do know that there are typical patterns that we get in Meniere's disease in the other investigations. Okay, to what extent we can say that they are diagnostic, I don't know. But then, is there more we can do? Definitely. Are there things that finding specific Meniere's findings we have? Yes, we have. For example, the shift in the frequency tuning in WEMP is a known thing. And caloric weakness with normal head impulse test is a known pattern now. Okay, a lot of
Type 2 hair cells are involved because.
Yes, sir. So those patterns are being told, but the diagnosis of Meniere's disease still rests on history.
Great. So, any experience about false positive ECOG test?
No, I have no experience of false or positive or false negative. I have no experience with ECOG personally because I don't have that device with me. Anybody else can chip in.
Sanjeev, sir?
As you rightly pointed out, it's more to do with, am I audible? I mean, it's
Yes.
more to do with the history, and you have discussed at length. Just want to add a few things which you said. You know, the American Academy, they keep changing the goalposts over the period of time. You've seen the 2007, they tried to classify this Meniere's into 4 different types, of certain, definite, probable, possible, and all that. Then they took away the certain because it's more to do with histopathology. Then now we are sure that at least that part is perfect. Now they've added another, idea of migraine into it. But if you look at the European Academy of Otology, Neurotology, the group, and the Japanese, they have been doing a lot of research. So what I've really gone through a meta-analysis, have found out the hearing part is more the European method to really get back. It's more to do with the symptom, science, history, everything from the American. And the Japanese are more into the definitive part. You missed out a few, not missed out, it was very extensive. I would beg to differ on a few points. If I may be allowed to talk, in the last probably 23 years, I've done just only 2 endolymphatic sac decompressions, but I've seen a lot of patients and only 4 labyrinthectomies. So as you rightly said, 80% of the patients can be managed up to a level of a chemical labyrinthectomy. And there is one more small, very small surgical procedure which might help. And that is depending on what is incapacitating the patient. Of the 4, is it progressive hearing loss, or the episodic vertigo, or a very annoying low-pitched tinnitus, or oral fullness? If oral fullness is the presenting symptom, you will see with time, few of the patients will first tell they've got a episodic vertigo, but at some point, they would say that oral fullness is really bugging them a lot. In those patients, just a tensor tenotomy will help, nothing more. And that is one of the, I think it was an ACTA, if I remember correctly, in 2013.
Exactly. So it is done in few centers, sir.
Yeah, and that is, I've done a few, and believe me, instead of doing all major morbid procedures, although in expert hands like you and Isha Diagnosis, all disciples, probably you can do it well. But in all centers, you can't be doing a vestibular nerve section for this. But as you rightly said, the endolymphatic sac decompression, probably in my cluster of patients, it hasn't really been that efficacious. But 3 canal labyrinthectomy, standard of care, destructive if there is a progressive hearing loss. I want to add one small point. The episodic vertigo, if it is associated with a progressive hearing loss with each subsequent attack, follow up the patient. If within 6 to 12 months, irrespective of what are the criteria the American Academy has told, if it has gone beyond the realms of serviceable hearing, I think it's futile to wait because you know you're going to go for a laboratory. That is really helpful. That side is not serviceable. Last point, the staging of Meniere's. Grading of Meniere's is okay, possible, this, that. Staging of Meniere's. The staging of Meniere's, unfortunately, it is not comprehensive and it does not include the vertiginous attacks into it or the tinnitus or the fullness. It's based on the progressive hearing loss, just like the Jurgens criteria, but there is this for the younger crowd who was listening on. This low or the mid frequency, 500 hertz, 1K, 2K, and 3K. That's it. So in these 4 frequencies, if it is around 25 to 40, you just start maintaining with all the conservative methods. But once it goes beyond 60, 65, or 70 for that matter, pure tone average I'm talking about, I think that's the time we have to intervene surgically. This is all that I can put in across.
Right, sir. So it's this staging is really a problem. Actually, the main problem is vertigo, and that has never been considered to be included.
Yes.
And that's one big thing. Okay, so next question, Dr. Suratwala sir. Coexisting Meniere's with autosclerosis. So how to go ahead means what's your experience with diagnosis and treatment? If autosclerosis and Meniere's, they are coexisting in a patient. Doctor?
Dr. Suratwala has an issue with this thing.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
not been able
Dr.
to.
Mohanty,
Yeah,
would
let
you
me
like
try
to
again.
this question?
Well, again, I go by the clinical science, and you're talking about the unilateral thing, right? Or a bilateral?
It is just a question by audience.
It's a
Maybe
question,
you-
okay.
with the-
So probably we, as Dr. Srinivas said, hi Srini, long time.
Hello, sir.
both,
we-
both the diseases have propensity to develop into bilateral.
Yes, correct. But here the audiometric tests are so important. Here, whatever test you can't, it's not an arithmetic diagnosis that up to the middle ear, up to the stapes foot plate, it is there, and then suddenly the saccule is not involved. Our saccule started to get involved, and we can identify with all the audiometric tests. Here, the CC will be extremely important, and I would definitely ask for an ECOG here, both the transtympanic and the extratympanic. You can't isolate. One has a good specificity, one has a good sensitivity. If you look at the transtympanic, it has got a very good sensitivity. But if you talk with an intact drum, there are a lot of things, CC you can do, you'll get an idea. If the percentage of CC is less than 60-70%, probably you can think it's more to do with autosclerosis. Beyond 70, probably there is a admixture of the Meniere's part which is getting involved. Here, radiology plays a big role, as you just touched upon it. The gadolinium part, as you all know, it concentrates in the perilymphatic space. And once you see the scala vestibuli narrowing down, you know you got to treat this as Meniere's rather than autosclerosis. If the scala vestibuli is of normal size, there's no ballooning of the region, then you know it's a very stable Meniere's to treat the autosclerosis. I've just had one experience of both together, so it's conjectural to really say how we would like to treat such patients. Srinivas, I think you can answer this.
Sir, you brought in a very beautiful perspective. In fact, I was actually thinking about how exactly this has been actually bugging me for a long time, and then the perspective that you bring in makes a lot of sense. I think we should be taking this approach. What to treat as more as a autosclerosis and what to treat more as a Meniere's based on radiology.
And Pavan is always there in the background, so always his name comes about. He's all over the place. Amit, when you talked about the WEM and its very limited role in Meniere's, I still beg to differ a little bit. It has a role. I'm not talking about the theoretical aspect of a CVAMP or something, going through the inferior vestibular nerve, going to the sacral. The acute crisis which you have sometimes to rule out, say, transient ischemic attack or a vascular lesion or some kind of a pathology which is lurking somewhere, you can rule out an otolith crisis by a VAMP. You can easily identify. So that will be, see, these diseases in the vestibular system are mainly diagnosed by a method of exclusion. You cannot pin, there's no diagnostic criteria. You have to rule out a few things and then get to a diagnosis. So CVAMP has a role to play, specifically that ratio I was talking about, when you need to know that in 1K divided by the response in 500 Hertz, and if it's more than 90%, you know it is definitely part of the sacral system.
So, no, definitely VAMP has a role. And
limited role.
Yeah. So there is another, I think Amit can take that question. Urinary spot sodium test. So do we require 24-hour urine sample?
No. It is a spot test.
Spot test. So
it is a spot test.
So, one question important aspect I will chip in the end. First, I will take a couple of questions. The doses of acetylzolamide is quite standard. I think 250 milligram TDS to QID. So along with the potassium supplement if the patient has some renal issues. How does the Grommet work?
So I mean, so actually they did a study that it released maybe some inner ear pressure, and actually they compared with the Meniere's device. So the Grommet and Meniere's device did work. So it was, I think,
more of a placebo sort
more
of
a refute that the Meniere's device is a very good thing. They started with doing nothing versus Grommet and versus
Can I put in a word here? It is nothing to do with a similar thing, different, not with the Meniere's device. You spoke about the chemical labyrinthectomy with the intermycin, 40 milligram, whatever. What is the dosage? I mean, what is the protocol that you have? You give one dose, and then how do you follow up with the second one, if at all? What do you do? I'm just asking. Regarding chemical labyrinthectomy, you take this.
So I will engage all of you in the next question, because that's okay. What all the questions are regarding. Before that, I am just taking some other questions. Then that actually discussion will go till length. So I am just avoiding for the moment right now. So I think most of the things have been taken. So we can go to the final question. That final question is regarding this intratympanic. So a lot of questions are there regarding intratympanic. So I think we can take one by one our own protocol, what we follow, and then we can sum up in the end. So I will ask Dr. Naresh Suratwala sir to start with his take on intratympanic things and what protocol does he follow. Naresh Suratwala sir. I think he still has an issue with his audio.
I think in the meanwhile, I think Dr. Seemab wants to ask some question.
Yeah, he is unmuted. He can ask.
He is unmuted. He can ask.
Oh, he muted himself again.
Okay, now I am.
No, he's unmuted. He's unmuted.
Yeah, thank you, Prahlad.
Yeah.
Right, playing Amit. Okay, so I've been listening in. Okay, and allow me to make a real fool of myself, because I'm going to ask a very stupid question. This is not something that you guys are discussing such high stuff, and I'm very new to Vertigo. Now, everywhere I've been listening in, and everybody says, and this is to all of y'all, okay? All I can see all of y'all, Srinivas, Sanjeev sir, Amit Kesri, and Narendra sir. And of course, Prahlad, because he's also good at this. Now, everybody says, and Pawan, I see Pawan now. Everybody says Meniere's is a history diagnosis, right?
Right.
So everybody says it's only purely on history, which means that by the time I have finished my first consultation with the patient, I have to be able to label him as a Meniere's disease. Then why do I really need further testings? Do I really need to get this guy tested again? That's my first part of the question. Second part, let's say you want to, you need some test to the differential diagnose and exclude the other diagnosis before you label Meniere's. So then which are the characteristic tests that you will do just to exclude that this is not anything else but Meniere's? And when in the second or third consultation do you finally label this patient as Meniere's? Because somewhere you have to give that patient a diagnosis. He's going to come back every time to you. He's not going to give you more different history than what you've taken in the first place. So I would like to know what are the characteristic history pointers to diagnose Meniere's, and when in that flow of the patient going, coming, do I finally stamp him as Meniere's?
I think it's an
Pardon me if it's very stupid, because I really don't know this at all.
It's a very relevant question.
Actually an excellent question. It's actually an excellent question.
Can I reply?
Yeah,
Anybody,
Mr.
please,
Go
just
ahead, go
clear
ahead.
it for me.
So actually, you are very right that when you first time see the patients, you can label them that, okay, not very certain, but yes, most probably it is Meniere's disease, because
So tell me the pointers.
pointers. So there are, I asked for 5 pointers. The first is that what is the duration of attacks? Okay. First. Second is there any oral symptom?
No, Amit, take that step by step. So if I'm asking duration of attack,
Okay.
at what duration do I say more likely to be Meniere's? What duration do I say not likely to be Meniere's?
So actually, typically, I mean, when the patient tells that how much it lasts, because we are already talking about minutes. Okay, it's not positional. Very sure, you have to be sure that it is not positional. If it is not positional, then you ask about the minutes. And once they say that after a few hours, they are absolutely fine. Okay, so it ranges from minutes to hours. And this is very, very important, because after a few hours, maybe a day or later, they are absolutely fine. So
Okay.
the other thing you find about the oral symptoms. Okay,
Fullness,
if there is
oral
a
fullness.
oral fullness, heaviness, hearing loss. Sometimes hearing loss is not that great to appreciate, but the fullness is most of the time there. The third thing I ask about, is there any autonomic symptoms? That I always out. There is maybe some GI symptoms, some reflux, some. I find that is if these two things are together, and if I find the autonomic symptoms, okay, I made up my mind. Now, to think otherwise that it is not a Meniere's, I do an audiometry, and audiometry, I always advise an SISI. So history is suggestive. Audiometry, hearing loss, either in low frequency or a kind of light audiogram, with SISI close to 90 to 100%, I tell the first time that it is Meniere's. Okay, unless otherwise proven. And I will tell him to maintain a diary, and I want to see with the drug therapy how his symptoms has gone down. So there is 3 things. The first is the duration of the symptom, the audiometry after the duration of the symptom, and the autonomic symptoms. And autonomic symptoms are so profound that when the patient have symptoms, that they will always tell you, and they have no attacks of vertigo in the initial when the medical therapy is working, but the autonomic symptoms usually come when they have the system.
Autonomic, we also asking about excessive sweating or some kind of.
Exactly.
Autonomic symptoms sometimes can be more problematic for the patient than the real
vertigo itself, because the patient has pre-nomination that now my fullness is increased and I have vertigo, but you have given drugs to control vertigo. See, we are not treating the disease pathology, we are treating the vertigo. So it is important to know that the autonomic symptoms are there, but as the disease get better, the autonomic symptoms become better. And autonomic symptom has very much relation with the anxiety and stress, which comes that, okay, now the episode of vertigo will come. Like when you have a severe migraine, you know that now you will vomit and other things.
So with this history, a CC is more than enough. Audiometry and a CC is more than enough to.
I agree. If the panelists differ, they can put it.
No, there is nothing to differ. Maybe I can just put it in a little, in the Barney Society. Same things what you have said, I will just put it in the words of the Barney Society criteria. So if Dr. Seema wants to label the patient as a probable Meniere's on the first episode. I hope you are able to hear me.
No, I
On the
don't
first
want to label him on the first episode. I'm asking you, when should I label him? Which...
No, you can. So you can label him. According to Barney Society, what you need to label him as a probable Meniere's, what you need to label just 2 episodes of vertigo. How long should those episodes have lasted?
You lost your audio.
2 hours. Along with the vertigo, he also should have had the fluctuating symptoms, the other symptoms, that is hearing loss, tinnitus, fullness in the ear. If you get this much fluctuating, you can place him as probable. Now, if you want to place him as definite Meniere's on the first visit, you can, provided. Now, for definite Meniere's, what is changing between probable and definite? I'll just tell you.
What do you mean?
What is changing is from the 20 minutes, the lowest criteria of 20 minutes is there. But instead of 24 hours, it is reduced to 12 hours. The reason is lasting longer than 12 hours could be migraine more likely. Okay, that is one. Lasting less than 20 minutes also can, those possibilities are there. The minute Meniere's also needs only one investigation. That is audiometric investigation. None of the sophisticated vestibular investigation. The audiometry investigation. Okay, that audiometry investigation is, you should have documented at least on one occasion. The next time, no problem. On one occasion, before, during, or after the episode, at some point of time, you should have documented a low frequency hearing loss. So if you have documented, there are 2 episodes. Two of these episodes lasting 20 minutes to 12 hours in the history, just 2, not more. And more is good, but minimum is 2, 20 to 12 hours, and at least at point of time, low frequency hearing loss along with the remaining fluctuating auditory symptoms. If you get this, and of course, in any criteria, whether you International Headache Society criteria or Barney Society criteria, that one last line will be there, not better accounted for by any disease. Okay, so that is of course that is safe for the criteria people also, for us also. Okay, but then in the clinical practice, this is what is required to make a diagnosis.
And
I think you are satisfied.
There is one query. Yeah, there is one query that yeah, Dr. Sanjeev, you can.
I just want to give some idea with a hands-on clinical practice, which very rightly pointed out by Seema Bhaisen. Here, these patients, if they come, our criteria is, again, people like us, we have sat down and made some criteria, and then finally we got it vetoed by some committee. But on the practical and the practical practice point of view, remember, these are all the hints that I can tell you, which probably might help in all of us. If the same patient keeps coming back to you with the same vertiginous attack, have Meniere's in the mind. And when you do a normal tuning fork test, you find an ABC reduced on a particular side, but the patient does not complain of hearing loss. And then you identify with audiometry test and some special tests, maybe SDA scores or the CC test or test of recruitment. That will stamp the criteria, which is meeting the international standards now of definitive and probable. But if the patient is predominantly coming for vertiginous attack and he says it's so debilitating that he's not able to maintain his normal lifestyle, but he has lost out on the hearing, but is not bothered about the hearing, then, and you have detected a hearing loss in your office, and you're surprised that he's already got a 30 dB loss in the low frequencies, but patient is not aware of it. One side is normal hearing. The threshold, if it's on that is a time when you think, okay, now I have to do a glycerol dehydration test. Let's see. Let us given for a salt restricted diet. Let's see for 6 months. And if within the 6 months, within what Srinivas has said, within 12 hours, the episodic attacks keep moving, then you are very sure, finally get into the gadolinium enhanced MRI. That's all that I would do like that.
Perfect. Thank you.
So there is one small query that autonomic symptoms, they are in almost all the vertigos. So what my take on this is that usually in other vertigo, it's limited to nausea, vomiting. But with Meniere's, it involves other domains also like sweating, maybe diarrhea also we have seen. So it's much more incapacitating than other normal, other causes of vertigo, the autonomic symptoms. So there are two last things which we need to chip in. Dr. Srinivas, vestibular
Yes, sir.
migraine versus Meniere's, just your comment. A key point in diagnosis, vestibular migraine versus Meniere's.
See, again, here, there are some things which the moment they come, then you can consider in terms of vestibular migraine. Like, for example, the very criteria of Meniere's disease is 20 minutes to 12 hours for the definite. So whenever a Meniere's, generally it is very unusual to see Meniere's disease episodes lasting long.
So we are losing your voice.
I think
More than so many patients we don't see.
Dr. Srinivas,
Hello?
your voice.
Any problem in listening to me, sir?
Your voice.
No, now we are here. Now we can hear.
Is it better now?
Yeah, it's better.
Hello? Okay. So one is the duration criteria. And one thing that is very much some kind of a signature of vestibular migraine is in vestibular migraine, you have in the same patient all the three different kinds of presentations. What are three different kinds of duration presentations? One duration is seconds. Another duration is minutes. Another duration is hours. Sometimes vestibular migraine also has something that lasts for days also. So different durations of vertiginous episodes in the same person goes more in favor of vestibular migraine. Whereas in Meniere's, it is not like that. Okay, it is generally not like that. Again, in vestibular migraine, what happens is the triggers can generally be identified. Most of the time, triggers can be identified. Even in vestibular migraine, you may get auditory symptoms, but those auditory symptoms are not temporally related to vertiginous episodes. Whereas in case of Meniere's disease, the auditory symptoms are very much related to the vertigo episodes. All of them happen together. So these are some of the pointers. And of course, if you have other like motion sickness in the same person, previous history of migraine headache in the same person, then all those things help us in putting the diagnosis as a migraine rather than Meniere's disease.
Okay, so I think I'll go back to the last question, or shall we stop it now?
I think we can take intertympanic.
No, we'll finish off. We'll finish off the question.
So that just last thing, just 30 seconds protocol, your own protocol of intertympanic injection therapy. So Dr. Mohanty, Dr. Srinivas,
Yeah.
and
So for me, it is 40 milligram in 2 ml. With a 1.5 milligram per kg body weight in diluted solution. But the reasoning is if the vertigo is more pronounced than the hearing loss, only then I will use this. Because if the hearing loss is much more out of proportion to the actual vertiginous attack, it's like general vertigo, you can see it. There's no nystagmus of the paralytic phase. Then I will use one short attack, we call it the shock attack, which is the acute necrotic criteria. And then over a period of time, I'll keep following up. That means after 4 to 6 weeks, I'll again review. And with some improvement, then I will not do any more injections. Otherwise, I'll give a diluted dosage for a maintenance dose. Again, there's no criteria for it. It's all individual, as you rightly said.
okay, Dr. Srinivas.
Yeah, see, when it comes to intratympanic dexamethasone, absolutely no hesitation. There are some patients for whom I have given that even before starting the medical management also. Okay, so for dexamethasone, I have no hesitation at all. And then there are two types of protocols I follow for dexamethasone. One protocol is the patient comes every alternate or once in 3 days. The other one is people
I think your voice is breaking.
they can come and they can Oh, I'll shut down my video. Okay. So there are two protocols. One protocol is that I can give every second or third day of dexamethasone, okay, for up to 4 doses or 5 doses. Then the other protocol that we give is the patient comes every 3 months once, takes a dexamethasone and goes. When it comes to gentamicin, I follow a single dose protocol, just only one single injection of gentamicin. That is the generally available same concentration, that is 40 milligrams per ml gentamicin, which we get.
2 ml.
So half an ml deposited into the ear.
But just I forgot to add one more thing, which probably Amit has, it was a slip of tongue. You said the beta-histine is an anti-histaminic nature, if I heard it correctly.
No.
It's something I have, maybe it's wrong. Just to clarify for the juniors, it's the H1 agonist and H3 receptor, H3 receptor blocker. So here we don't need to taper it like the steroids and anything. You can go on the high dose according to the criteria, as you said. 48 PDS for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, you can give, nothing will happen.
I think it's an excellent discussion by the panelists. And unfortunately, Dr. Suratwala's audio had some problem. We could not interact with him. So I think that's all for today. And before,
sir, 1 minute. I think, sir, one minute. There is one question which is repeatedly coming. People keep asking, what is the dose of dexamethasone? Dose of dexamethasone is the same dexamethasone which you get in the vial, and you can't use in India. You don't get any other dexamethasone, and that one only 0.5 ml or 0.4 ml goes into the
0.5
ml goes into the middle ear. That's all.
16 mg.
That's
Or you
4
can
mg
use methylprednisolone.
4 mg per ml, I think.
4 mg per ml.
Exactly. You can use methylprednisolone. Methylprednisolone has
Long acting,
and it stays more in the vestibule.
I also prefer methylprednisolone than
it has more penetration. It is more.
but it
better
only
neural that response.
it only increases the threshold of the.
I think we can take autoimmune diseases. Autoimmune diseases usually has bilateral thing, and many of them have some systemic involvement. Whenever we have a big immunology department here, and when they diagnose autoimmune diseases, they want something, and then you can do ANCA screen, but sometimes it comes negative. So autoimmune diseases, there is no single test which can tell us, but if it is a symmetrical bilateral involvement with this kind of symptoms and some immunological in other areas like eye or ENT or any systemic diseases, you can tell that it is there.
Right. So before signing off, I'll request whoever is not a member of NES to contact Dr. Amit Keshri to be a member. The forms are available on the website, as well as it's already being shared in the chat box. And this coming Friday, we will have a very interesting session on case-based panel discussion by Dr. Vishal Pamar, and Dr. Amit Keshri will moderate. We will have Dr. Srinivas, Dr. Avinash Bijlani, Dr. Sandeep Sharma, and Dr. Kshitij Malik as the panelists. So it will be a case-based discussion. So I think a lot of practical learning will be there. And I thank you all to join today. I think we can call it a day.
Yes, sir. Thank you. It was
Thank
a
you
very
all. Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks, Srinivas.
Interacting with all of you.
Sir, Dr. Amit, actually, this has to be made. Whatever he has compiled is the best compilation when it comes to Meniere's disease. He should be publishing this as a position paper or something.
Yeah, he has almost covered almost all the aspects. So that's a
Indian position paper. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you both the Amits and Srinivas and Prahlad Rajeshwar.
Thank you, sir. And I think I will get back to you for a few points here.
Sure. Anytime.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Prahlad, sir, for
Most welcome.
office support.
Thanks, Prahlad. Good night.
Yeah. Good night, all. Take care of
I think you
yourselves.
can end the meeting because nobody will leave.
Okay.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.